Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. We're a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over us. I think I said that. See, this is why they like the live reads, because when I mess up, I don't bother to edit it out. Anyway, we're a place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we'll introduce you to the guest who hasn't been on the show yet, and we're going to let Miss CJ Brightley go first. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm CJ Brightley. It's a pen name, but it's me. I write noble bright fantasy and Christian fantasy, and some of it has romance and some of it doesn't. Some of it has magic, some of it doesn't, but I thought it would have magic. It always surprises me. I'm kind of I write out of order and without plotting ahead of time, and so all of my stories are a surprise to me most of all. And it's a lot of fun. My next book I just finished a Kickstarter for it, and I am shipping out the paperbacks to everyone as soon as they arrive, which should hopefully be next week.
So what you're saying is your muse or your mind squirrels, however you choose to refer to them, they are a little bit ADD, is what you're telling me?
A lot ADD.
And,
a lot of the advice to build a brand is to find your niche, and my niche is whatever I am in the mood for when I start writing that book. So
you kind of take the Chloe approach. You just, instead of taking the path, you just plow through the forest and hope something's on the other side.
It's always there.
It will be interesting. Whatever it is, it's going to be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, we could probably do a whole panel on this because I didn't even know what to think. But what is Christian fiction? I mean, fantasy.
Well, mine is a little different. Narnia is a classic example. There's allegory, but it's very clear allegory. Ted Dekker and Frank Peretti are kind of slightly more modern examples. They have allegorical elements, but they also have characters who are presented with the gospel or presented with very clear allegories for like sin or different aspects of God. My Christian series is set in a dystopian version, near future version of this world. So there are allegorical elements, but there are also some clear gospel presentations in the story, which is not what I anticipated when I started writing it. I didn't even know it was going to go that direction.
So as a fantasy, would that mean you can have like goblins, elves, the standard fantasy tropes, or is it all like more paranormal urban fantasy?
You could have those things. My version ended up having fae and also something that's kind of vampire-like. Explaining them would be major spoilers. But they're kind of vampire-like, and a demon and an angel and some wolf monsters that were kind of inspired by the wargs running around in downtown Washington, D.C.
I mean, couldn't get any worse than it is now. I've had to drive through their traffic. So
I live right outside DC, and when I do local events and I tell people that there's a dystopian government that's brainwashing people and drones flying around and all these monsters and brainwashing and drugs and everything, and they're like, oh, so it's not fiction.
Yeah, I live in Hampton, so I feel your pain.
Like, so you wrote a political documentary.
So it's basically a larger umbrella that could include all shades of the fantasy story. So
yeah, my daughter's reading.
Ask to modern settings.
It could be in modern settings. My daughter's reading a Christian fantasy series that's probably a little more allegorical, but it has dragons and imps and elves and like little fairies and other like more traditional fairy fantasy type creatures. And it's in an alternate world. So, more of what you think of as a fantasy world rather than DC.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know when I was at Nova, some of the frequent customers at the coffee shop I worked at, I was at Villanova, is where I did grad school, were the brothers, the monks that, because the college is also a functioning monastery. And they had actually, we had this conversation once, although I was on so much caffeine, I only remember parts of it. But they had mentioned that some of the fantasy elements could be explained by like the obscure references, like the Nephilim and stuff in I think the Old Testament. I'm not as versed in any of that because that's not my faith system. But so it's just interesting. I didn't know that was a thing. We'll have to get with you and find some of the other authors, and that might be something that's interesting to talk about. Just because, like I said, I didn't even know it was a thing. So I am adding that to the future panel list. And apparently, Chloe just volunteered herself.
I would love to come back for that. There's a lot of really interesting Christian fantasy out there right now. It's kind of really blossomed in the past probably decade or so. When
people think religious fiction, be it movies, books, whatever, the stereotype is it's all badly written. So it's nice to see that people are trying to change that and, putting their money where their mouth is with their belief structure, whatever that is. I wonder if there's an equivalent. Is there like a Muslim fantasy or Jewish fantasy? Any of the other religions that are the major ones? I'll have to do some research. That will be a future episode. People
answers, but those are big tangent answers.
We'll have to do that as a panel because that sounds like it'd be interesting. I just didn't want to pigeonhole us only to talk about one because I didn't want to exclude other listeners. So, but that's something we can get with offline and schedule. All right. Before we dive any further, Miss Chloe, Madam Chloe, first of the line, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I am Chloe Garner. I write science fiction, fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal, borderline horror, depending on how strict your constitution is. Presently, right this close on the edge of closing out a massive fantasy universe, and we're celebrating tonight when I get done with my podcast. So I'm having a great day.
Good. And how high are you riding on those endorphins for finishing?
I've been working on this novel for substantially longer than any novel in years. It is the longest novel that I have written by a good 150 or 200 pages. And I have been working in this world for 3 years and 27 books. You guys are going to get a side of me you may never seen before.
I'm so glad we're here for this. I am totally here for Chloe completely and utterly high without having touched anything that would make her high besides the happy. The happy words.
High of absolute spectacular proportions.
To quote our DARE instructor, she's high on life.
Love it.
Do they even still do the DARE program, or is that just something us old people did?
No, that's a thing. My daughter did graduation from DARE last year. It's still a thing.
Okay. All right. And last but certainly not least, Madam Jena S. Brown, or the many personalities thereof. So who are we talking to today?
For today, we're focused with Jena Rey. Jena Rey writes the weird and the wonderful with smoochies. So I tend to write science fiction, urban fantasy, everything under that speculative umbrella. And usually there is a romance line in it, though most of the time for this pen name, it's really subtle. I write all-out romance under my Jiggle and Asher pen name. And I'll bring that up simply because there may be some crossover there because there are some interesting things with romance that happen that also fall in kind of these categories.
Right,
so that's what I do. I do romance on the one side and then lots and lots of speculative stuff with, the occasional romance on that side.
And all right, before we get started, CJ, you do have to answer the religion question. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Firefly.
Excellent answer. What is it about that appeals to you?
It's just more fun and adventurous and magical. I feel like it's more clever.
Perfectly acceptable reason to like something. All right. And because we're polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Narnia, all the way.
Okay. That is an excellent choice. I remember reading those as a kid. We used to have Lord of the Rings because it is the iconic, but it was so unfair to everyone else. We had to take it off the list.
It is. It's the hands down winner.
All right. So we asked this to every one of our new guests. One of the crying shames of growing up and getting older is people stop asking you the important questions. So we are bringing it back. Madam, what is your favorite dinosaur?
I was not really into dinosaurs. My brother was into dinosaurs. But I was really into owls. So I
Okay.
really liked
That was good.
basically every owl. I knew all my owls when I was 3. I knew all their faces, all the colors of their plumage at every age. I probably liked snowy owls and barn owls the best.
Okay.
All right, she can stay. We like her.
She's
Owls are cool.
acceptable.
Well, I mean, owls are also important in mythology, and because a project that I'm working on both with my former author companion and now Jana is doing a lot of research in the ancient religions. So owls come up a lot
Yes.
with the ancient Greeks and Celts. And
Mhm.
so I didn't know snow owl was a thing. Is it just because they're white?
I think so. I don't
They're
remember.
where they're
a lot.
very northern,
Yeah,
and they
they're
survive deeper winter than just about anything else. They hunt in the dead of winter, and they're stunning animals.
Mhm.
and I
Okay.
love that the owls are so quiet and yet deadly.
I know
Birds are pretty.
we had a recently in Hampton Roads, they did a Ren Fair, small one at one of the local breweries. They hosted it in their big parking lot. And so they had a bunch of people. And one of the events they had was an organization, and I can't remember it because I wish I did. I'd link to them because they do charity work. But basically, they rescue animals from the Back Bay area, nurse them back to health, and then hopefully try to re-release them into the wild. The ones they brought for the event, though, were ones that couldn't be released, so they're used to people handling them. Because obviously, if you want to release it into the wild, you can't get it too accustomed to people. And they had some owls, and my son was like, "Can we get one of those for a pet?" I'm like, no, we're not getting a barn owl for a pet. Not until you get a barn,
Awesome.
I bet there are
No,
people
it's
out there,
barn.
man.
right? But yeah, so I've seen the barn owls. I don't know what breed that is. That's what they just called it. They said, "Hey, it's a barn owl." But they also had falcons, which was kind of cool too.
Mhm.
The falcons just looked like it wanted to peck your eyes out, even when they said it was being friendly.
Yeah, they have that look to them.
So, all right. And because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, we are no longer knuckle-dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
I like the idea of tea. I actually drink a lot more coffee, and I really like lots of creamer with my coffee. Lots of creamer.
Girl, you are speaking my language.
So it's
My dad,
coffee flavored creamer.
Yes.
Coffee flavored.
basically, my dad tells me when I grow up, I'll drink it black. So I guess I'm going to live forever because I'm never growing up. I like my creamer. And I don't mind tea, but a product of the South. So tea should be drinking one way, iced and sweet. It should be diabetes in a cup.
Stick straight up and down when you let go.
Absolutely. We call that table wine, and I'm here for it. But unfortunately, my waistline doesn't. And so part of the reason I lost 60 pounds was I did give up the tea. My teeth probably thank me for that too, because that's a lot of sugar.
A lot of sugar.
All right. So before we get started, obviously, if you read the title, dear listener, the topic of this panel is Noble Bright Fiction. It came to us because Chloe said, "Hey, we should talk about this. It would be fun." And if you do, you have to invite CJ. She's like the guru, expert, mistress of the genre. So here we are. But before we can talk about the genre, let's define our term. So what is Noble Bright Fiction?
So I don't own the word, but I like to. I define it as the opposite of grimdark, but not in a negative, we hate those grimdark people way, but it's a completely different worldview. In grimdark, kind of stereotypically, I think of it as the world is grim and dark, people are horrible. The most that the characters can hope for is to like claw their way to the top before they get stabbed in the back. And I see that as a very depressing world, but also I think a lot of times it's written from a very cynical worldview where it doesn't make sense to write a good guy, because if they're a good guy, they're naive and pointless. Their actions are pointless in the whole structure of the world. And so in a Noble Bright world or a Noble Bright story, being the good guy is not silly and pointless and naive. It's a courageous choice. And it doesn't mean that everything is always going to turn out happy at the end and that everything's going to be good and all the bad things will always just be untrue. Although I think that is true in a larger religious sense, that doesn't necessarily mean the story is going to end that way. But a good character doing the right thing or striving to do the right thing out of a sense of morality is a worthwhile thing to write in that world, that their choices can make the world a better place, even if the costs are high.
Yeah, I
I
see.
think
Go ahead,
Chloe.
Jen. Okay. I see in reader groups a lot where the grimdark fans mock Noble Bright as conflict-free fiction. And it's like, this is the moment where I'm like, okay, I know that this is a CJ thing, and I love writing. I've been in three of her anthologies, and I love writing around her and being in that wake. But Art is going to talk back, and I have opinions. And I think
no, not Chloe.
No, I don't. I'm off the rails tonight, guys. Here we go. No, Noble Bright fiction and even classic fantasy that all fits really well into that same idea of Noble Bright fiction isn't a conflict light fantasy. It's a fiction that takes seriously that cause and effect happens, and that doing good things and making big sacrifices and making hard choices has downstream benefits, and the corollary that making bad decisions has bad consequences, which is one of those things that even non-grimdark stuff really misses the ball on a lot, where characters made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and the plot just assumes that that's normal, and we all go on, and that's going to be how this works, and nothing really happens, and we go on with our dysfunctional lives. And the idea that making the good decisions and avoiding the bad decisions leads to a building outcome that is better than it would have otherwise been is just so central to what Noble Bright is. It's that striving for the good outcomes through sometimes seriously intense and not PG-13 conflicts.
Yeah.
So, according to Professor Google, and they are never wrong, I'm told, Noble Bright books focus on themes of the hope and the human spirit, and may touch on adult situations like sex or violence without being overly lurid. Ooh, new word. I like that. I haven't heard that one in a while.
Lurid? Oh, that's a good word. It is.
Yeah. I would normally just scandalous, or salacious, but lurid's a good word. Some examples of popular Noble Bright fiction include Advent Honor, Reconnoiter, I don't know what that is, Hope and the Patient Man, and the Bee Sting Cake, which I guess are books. And so I thought, that's a good answer. I know what grimdark is because I've read some of them, and I realized that life's too dark already. I've seen the darkness in the world just through my travels with the Army. I don't need to wallow in it. So I'd prefer that there be a light at the end of the tunnel, and I want that light not to be the train that's about to run me over. I want to know there's hope. I don't mind dark settings as long as there's a hope at the end that it can be better. So I don't know if that would qualify it, that hope at the end would make it count, or it has to be kind of bright during too. I don't know.
I don't think it has to be bright. The story that you're telling, like the character's experiences don't have to be bright for it to be a Noble Bright story. It's that there is hope that the hardships they're enduring are going to be worth it, or that they're going to make the world a better place through going through what they're going through.
I mean, this is a great term for it, Noble Bright, but the other one that I hear that I think is very similar is hope punk. That idea, because they're following cyberpunk and diesel punk and all that kind of stuff, but the idea is hope punk, that they want something where it ends up in a hopeful way. Even if you can't save the entire world, the things that you did made a difference, and it means that there's hopefulness and there's a bright outlook that things can be overcome, that in some way good does overcome evil, and that that it's okay to say that there is such a thing as absolute good and absolute evil, which is something that in a lot of culture that we have at this point, we're not allowed to say. At least that's the feeling, is that you're not allowed to draw those lines. And when we're talking about hopeful things, when we're talking about these kinds of things, we want to be able to say that there are some things that you can definitively say are good and bad, and we want to choose the things that are going to make life better, not only for ourselves, but for those around us. And I like that aspect of it too, that it's inherently, the ones I've looked at and the ones I've written, it's not about being selfish. It's about looking out and saying the people and the people I love and the world that I love and that kind of stuff. I'm there for it. I'm ready to do the sacrifice. I'm ready to do those things because it's inherently an unselfish way of looking at things and going, what do I do for the betterment of everybody?
So basically the opposite of the Church of the Dude, where it's like, oh, that's just like your opinion, man.
Yep.
So you want definitive good and evil. Go on, CJ.
There's going to be gray, but there's more definition to it. Go, CJ.
If I could interject a little bit, I think there's a lot of overlap between Hope Punk and Noble Bright. Noble Bright has tried, I think, as a word to stay relatively apolitical, but some of us are definitely more on the politically conservative Christian side, and we're not trying to make Noble Bright like a political type of genre at all. But most of us support like traditional marriage, things like that. And Hope Punk, I think, was explicitly very left leaning and very politically left. So I think like the definition of it may be the same, but I think that the things that that Noble Bright writers and the things that Hope Punk writers might define as the goods that they're working towards might not be the same.
And they won't have an audience that necessarily has a massive overlap.
Right.
As those are the things that really hit the ideals.
Yeah, like we are defining good in a broad sense as the same way, like we're willing to make sacrifices for the people we love and things like that. But the vision of an ideal world at the end of the book or an improved world at the end of the book might not be as similar as you think at first.
Well, what that actually proves is that left, right, or center, crazy Uncle Joe. Well, actually, that's not a good one anymore, given the president. And I don't want that to be political, but it sounds like, no, I know. I really try hard to be apolitical. Really one of the things I learned in business classes was unless politics is your business, keep your politics out of your business. But what I mean is that there's that underlying desire for something better. That's just part of the human condition. If you get two extremes of political and theological and whatever it is, if you've got two ideals that are counter to each other, but they still are getting to the same place of we want something better, that shows you some of this is universal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we see it in marketing too. Alex Newton, who does the K-Lytics report, talked about how during COVID, the first thing that they saw was this push where people were reading more dystopia, more grimdark, things like that, and kind of just wallowing in the arg that was everything.
There's
but
a
then very
quickly,
though, they found the opposite started to happen, where they wallowed for a little bit, and then people started looking for books that had a lot more hopeful themes. He says, you started seeing these huge rises in Christian fiction. You started seeing huge rises in clean and wholesome romance, in more classic kind of fantasy, all that kind of thing. And he says, dystopian, you saw this huge fallout where people didn't want to read about the dark and gritty anymore because they already felt like they were living it. So they were looking for something to bring them to a place that was not dark and gritty and scary. And you could see it in the marketing reports. So it was a more general thing because that was, just across the markets. He's like, we're seeing these extremes, and we're seeing a lot of people go for the stuff that is kind of that opposite of what they feel like they're living in.
That tracks because I know with military science fiction, as the wars overseas heat up, military science fiction isn't selling as much as the same military themes in like space opera because it's less what's going on in the real world because people see those things and they think that could be now. So it makes sense that those themes would be cyclical, contrary to what we're experiencing. Yeah. When things are good, you can stomach reading some of the dystopia. When that looks more like your reality, maybe you want something different. So I know it seems like just as a universal theme, this tracks was one of the things I remember when I made sergeant in the Army, my platoon sergeant told me, because this happened to be my promotion ceremony was in Iraq, was that there are two things that are inevitable. Everybody dies. And if you're going to send people to war, make their deaths matter. It sounds like that's kind of a theme in this genre too. You don't necessarily have a problem with characters dying or bad things happening as long as it matters to the plot, as opposed to like Firefly where they killed Wash and it was just for no reason and I'm still bitter.
Why do you bring that up?
I'm still very angry about that. Yes.
If you're going to kill him, like, anyway, that's another rant for another day. But the point is I do think it sounds like that's what you're saying is if the bad things happen, make it matter.
Yeah.
Right. And not just, it's a Tuesday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We don't want bad things happen in war. And so we have now just killed off a bunch of your favorite characters versus their death means something. It's taking a stand somewhere. It's doing something that matters.
And to be a little bit shallow and petty, it means that as an author, you can't hide behind, I'm just going to kill a character for drama.
Uh-huh.
Yep. And there are repercussions too. It can't just be like, oh, well, we killed this character. Moving on. Like I think in a Noble Bright book, you're upholding the value of human life. Like if the sacrifice is made, it really matters. And the other characters need to recognize that as important and, worthy of grieving and thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you go through bad things and you see people that are close to you die, or you have to do dark deeds in service of a greater good, like if that doesn't affect you, you're a sociopath or it's a bad writer. But there's got to be a reason, right? Like, because otherwise, just human nature. I mean, look at how many people just in your real life who freak out a little bit when they accidentally run over a squirrel crossing the road or whatever. It's because life matters intrinsically, I think, to most people.
Yeah.
Until life makes them jaded.
No, that's genuinely something I judge books by is when they start killing off characters. If I don't care, I'm done with the book and largely the author because they've failed in something fundamental about creating a character in a world. And some of them, they're big names that people really, really love. And everybody talks about how invested they were. And I'm like, dude, they killed off everybody but the one guy. And at the end, I was like, I don't care if he dies. And that's a terrible situation to live in as a reader.
That was one of the reasons, like, one of my readers convinced me to read Joe Abercrombie's The Law of the Nines, I think, or whatever, one of his grimdark books. And that's one of the things I realized that I didn't like about grimdark through reading that book. And I gave it a fair chance. And dear listener, the fact that I didn't like it doesn't mean it's a bad book. He's an excellent writer. It's just not for me. Mm-hmm. But I realized that a lot of the grimdark, I don't like any of the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't care if they died because there were no good guys or bad guys. Everybody sucked.
And I don't think it's good for us as human beings to become more jaded to people who are, I mean, yes, they're fictional, but if you immerse yourself in the story and you still don't care, then you're desensitizing your own heart to death and distraction. And I don't think that's good for us as people.
To people outside of yourself.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the reasons that I think that one of the things the romance community of readers gets right, they call them book boyfriends for a reason, because they get invested in the characters. I don't think there's a term equivalent in other genres, but the basic idea is, yes, if the book is well written, you do care about them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's become infamous on this podcast, but one of the authors who I absolutely love, I argue with him all the time about who the main character is. And he does not agree with me, and I am right because I bought the book. So that's my opinion. Anyway,
that once you send it out into the wild, you kind of lose control over certain aspects of your book because the readers will come back and tell you, "Oh, yes, I'm so glad you wrote this, and it was about this, this, and this." And I went, "Okay, that's not what I intended when it went out there, but I'm glad that it hit you in a way that it mattered." Because I've had that feedback, and I'm sure you ladies have too, where it's like, that is not exactly where I saw that going, but this is what my readers are coming back with. Well, neat. So you do lose a little bit of, you do the best you can, and then you see what they bring into the mix, because every reader brings their own background with them.
And then so Art talks back.
There is a theory that is competing in fiction that we can do a panel on, that not today, where it's either it's the intent of the author, original intent, essentially, versus the reader. And there's a word for it where the readers get to decide what it means after it's out there. And they both kind of disagree with each other. I think if the author meant, and this is my opinion, but if the author wanted it to mean something and they didn't clarify it enough that we all knew that, then that was their fault, and we get to do what we want with it. But I do understand
ground there that accommodates all of the rational opinions, and yours is not one of them.
I'm okay with that. I've been called lots of things in my life, and rational has very rarely been that. So, all right. So, are there, speaking of the readers take, are there any common themes that you think are in Noble Bright fiction?
In a very broad sense, it's like writers, the characters choosing to do the right thing when it's hard or it's going to cost them. But I mean, there are a million different ways that can play out. Sometimes it's a character who starts out the book as very afraid, and I don't want to say cowardly, but just very afraid to do the right thing or stick up for the underdog or whatever, and they have to learn through the story to be more brave and, you know, stand on what is right, even if it's scary. One of the things I don't see versions of in other like non-Noble Bright books as much is the redemption of a bad character who genuinely was the bad guy or did something actually bad, even if they weren't like defined by their evil. And a true redemption arc where it's more than just like, well, I decided to be on the good side now, but like where they actually repent of what they did wrong and try to change, like make amends and actually act in the opposite way for the rest of the story. And I haven't seen that as much in anything that's not, wouldn't really be defined as Noble Bright, but a true redemption arc is a really beautiful thing that I think Noble Bright mostly owns.
Do you think there are any lines that are, you've crossed the line so far, there is no coming back then in the genre? And I'll give you an example in fiction. Darth Vader iconically blowing up Alderaan. He killed an entire planet's worth of people. Would that be a line too far, for instance?
Bad. I think it is a lot harder to do in general market Noble Bright because there are things that are just so bad that the reader cannot forgive them. I think you can actually go darker in Christian fantasy. Chloe's nodding. I don't know if you've read my Christian fantasy series, but I have a very dramatic redemption arc in my Christian fantasy series because one of the characters is a Paul character. And so he spends the first book and a half basically doing Joseph Mengele style medical research on the Fae, who are
so very dark.
Yeah, like almost sinless, beautiful creatures who have never done anything bad to him. But he truly believes that he is doing what is the best for the people, and he believes that he is nobly sacrificing his own peace of mind and his own happiness in order to combat the danger of the Fae. And then he eventually realizes that he was wrong and he was on the wrong side, and repents of it and changes sides. But I think you can only do that dramatic of a change when there is a supernatural forgiveness, because it's hard to justify that in a general market book. I mean, maybe it can be done. I have not seen one that I found really compelling.
I think the further you push that character out, the harder you have to work as an author to redeem them. But I look at that as a challenge accepted moment, not as I couldn't do that. You know, let's talk about Darth Vader. What additional work could you have done to put in at the end of the last movie to turn him into a character who saw what he had done was wrong, realized the gravity of it, bore that, and turned away from it? And that's something that even outside of a religious context, you can have a reader group, maybe not all of them, but none of my books convince everybody, that accepts and embraces that this is a villain who figured it out, and you respect that and you admire that. And even if you can't let go of it, it's something that you can appreciate, that this happened and it's real. And that's cool.
And I think
I
there's
don't.
something beautiful in like the living out the repentance rather than just like, oh, I realized I was wrong, and so I'm going to make a dramatic sacrifice. The end.
Yeah, and I'm dead.
Yeah, and I'm dead. And then
Because Space
I
Ghost,
mean,
yeah, that
great.
didn't settle for me either.
No, I have issues. But and the other
That's
thing is you have to think about the taking joy in evil, in the suffering of others and in things like that. That's a weight that is very different than when you see people that, well, like you said, somebody who's doing this but believes that it's for a noble cause. Or in the original trilogy only, original being the middle three, because I'm old enough that the original is the middle three. When you follow that Darth Vader act, many of the things that he does leading up are military decisions. He doesn't actually blow up Alderaan. Tarkin does that. It's not on him. It's a choice that's made through the Empire. Now, he's part of that. He's definitely there, but there's a whole structure going on and a hierarchy going on, and there's things that he does, and it's in service of this certain military power. There's certain this, that, and the other, and in that way, it's a step back. It kind of absolves some of that, and you can see the stress differently. And there's a comic series that goes along with that I was reading, and it's really interesting because it looks at, what's he really going through when he realizes he has a son, when he realizes all these things are going on. And we didn't get to see that on the screen. And the comic books are really, really good about what's
see
going
that
through his brain as he's doing that. But how do you put all that on a screen? I became a much bigger, I had much more problems with it when they started expanding beyond those movies, because now we start getting Darth Vader. We get the Darth Vader from the Kenobi series, and he has seriously got issues. He is dragging people through the street with the Force. He is chopping down children because he can't, because he knows it'll bring Kenobi out so that they can have a fight. When you see him at the end of Rogue One, he is taking people apart because he can, and there's a joy in that that sours the redemption arc for me, because now I need him to have more time. I need him to go through more redemption in order for my heart to believe it. So I have to kind of cut out some of that other noise in order to keep that redemption arc, because for me, the deeper they are into enjoying the evil, into that being something that they desire, that they want to do, that they take glee in, all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that you can't convince me they can be redeemed, but you're going to have to pull that arc a lot longer. I'm going to have to see them come through the pain of repentance, the pain of whatever it takes to be redeemed. And you can't just give me and I did a noble sacrifice at the end, and now it's okay, and I'm a Force ghost. You can't have that from me anymore when you've taken it to that extreme, versus people who were doing evil and they didn't know. I write about a whole series of people that they're going to war because they are magically brainwashed. And when that goes away, they
so
look around and they go,
consent.
"Oh crap, we don't want to be, can we go home? Can we just please go home?" And everybody's like, "Oh, how do we stop fighting them? Because they've killed people." But they weren't in control of their faculties when they did. How do we forgive them for this evil thing they did when it wasn't them? It wasn't them that was pushing it. And that's an
So
interesting question, because it's a redemption there where all they want is to go home. Go ahead, Jer.
you're asking some deep questions. So, like when you mentioned Darth Vader in the military organization, you get to questions like, what role did the individual SS operator have or in responsibility for the larger,
Yep.
Third Reich Incorporated, or if you don't have the appropriate mens rea, like the child soldiers that were happening in Africa in the 90s, what role did they have for the horrific deeds they encountered? Now, are those kinds of heavy moral themes common in the genre, or just stuff you guys are writing?
When I do it.
I don't think it's everywhere, but I do think it comes up a lot, because part of what we're asking is, what's the nature of faith? What is the nature of redemption? What's the nature of
Good and
our role
evil.
in the world? Good and evil. And so those are the kinds of topics that people have warred with forever. We always ask these questions, and you can look historically. So many wars fought over what is the answer to these questions. What is the nature of good and evil? What is the nature of perception? What is all those things? So I think those tend to come up because they've always come up.
Okay, well, before we dive to more questions, because I have more to ask, for today's sponsor, we are being sponsored by the Phoenix Crate subscription service that CJ Brightley runs, which is all about Noble Bright books. So, can you give us the pitch for that?
Sure. It's a quarterly subscription box that I pick the books. They're books that I think exemplify Noble Bright fantasy. I read a lot, and I want to share my favorites with you. They're clean enough for readers ages 13 and up. Most of them are appropriate for ages 11 and up. Every now and then we have some with more mature themes, but they're not raunchy or anything. They just may have more adult concepts and themes. Most of them are paperbacks. They're either signed or have a signed book plate. And then along with the book, we have thematically related bookish goodies. So maybe a journal with the cover art kind of fits the theme of the book, or tea, or we've had little steampunk bud vases before several years ago. I have a lot of fun picking out the items that go with the books. There's the regular box, which has the main book and 3 to 5 bookish goodies, and a postcard that has the theme reveal for the next quarter's box. And the deluxe box also has a second book that is related to the theme in some way by a different author. So you can get both of those or just one. And there's also an option, if you don't want the goodies, you can get just the books. And so some people choose that. I send it out every quarter. They are shipped on between the 10th and the 15th of March, June, September, and December. So your December box generally arrives right before Christmas, so it's a perfect Christmas gift. And that's about it. I think I will share a discount code with you, and then you can put that in the show notes too. So,
Sweet.
Cool.
Yeah. Any questions about that?
It sounds fun.
Sounds fun. I'm gonna
fun.
suggest something to you, because I'm stealing this shamelessly from Michael J. Allen's Kickstarter that we recently did an interview on. But one of the things he did, which I've never seen other authors do, but I think it's kind of cool, is he actually had a tier where it's the book club tier, where you get 2 copies of the book, so you can read it, you can gift it to a friend, and you can read the books together and talk about it. And I think, as we're trying to build more community around the kind of things we like, because I started thinking about that more from the marketing, but that's the kind of stuff where you can get people on board.
You could do that. With Phoenix Crate, you can have 2 subscriptions under the same account, and they can ship either together or separately. So you could have your regular box plus an additional copy of the same book if you wanted. I have one subscriber. It's really sweet. She always gets 2 complete boxes, and she says one of them is for her daughter-in-law. And it just, every time I ship her boxes, it just makes me happy, because I'm just like, oh, that's so sweet that you share this love of Noble Bright Fantasy with your daughter-in-law and get to, I imagine them like reading the books together.
Like, one of the things you see a lot if you watch any kind of the YouTube book communities is it's very popular to rage against what you don't like. And this company hates you, don't buy their stuff. I'm thinking, that was good at first. Like, we had to make people aware that these companies had values counter to yours, whatever those may be, because I'm sure regardless of your political ideology, there's someone out there who disagrees with you and actively tries to subvert that with their books. And that's fine. It's a risk you take when you go political. But instead of doing that, I think it's time we all started saying, what do we like and why? And let's support that instead. Put our money where our mouth is and support the things we do like. And that's why I try to encourage people, like, if you like something, get your friends hooked. Give them the first hit of crack free, and then we move on. Take that, Nancy Reagan. So I'm sorry, I'm a product of my time, all right?
Wow.
All right, so, given the themes of morality that you 3 have discussed, and obviously you've made no bones about your own religious convictions, do you think Noble Bright specifically is Christian-oriented, or does it work for anyone with a moral belief structure, regardless of where it comes from?
That's interesting, because most of the Noble Bright fantasy authors that I know their religious affiliation. Most of them are Christian. Some, I think, are maybe a few are Mormon. I think Jeff Wheeler is
Jeff is.
Mormon, maybe. Um, and I would have said it generally comes from a more Christian worldview, but Intisar Kanani is a devout Muslim, and I really loved her book Thorn and Sunbolt and like that series. And I think they're Noble Bright. Thorn is more on the darker side of Noble Bright, but it's Noble Bright. It has the right morality and ideals behind it. Um, the character is really struggling with some really dark things. So I would have said it was mostly Noble Bright, but I mean, mostly Christian perspective, but I think there are some non Christians who have this a worldview that is close enough um, that they can write Noble Bright fantasy. So it is Noble Bright fantasy is not a perfect analog for Christian fantasy. They don't perfectly overlap in terms of the authors. There is a lot of overlap, but not completely.
And looking at the readers that come and hang out on my reader group and talk and are human beings that I feel like I begin to know, I don't feel like there's any religious prerequisite for this to be a genre that really hits their taste. So I don't think that it's for a religious even market. Christian or otherwise. I think that that Noble Bright is something that people who really enjoyed classic fantasy are going to come and feel like they're at home here.
I think some people like it because they are looking to not be kind of beaten over the head with darkness and maybe a worldview that they really disagree with, but they're not necessarily looking for something that is explicitly religious, or they don't necessarily want a message other than like be kinder, be nicer. And I mean, I do think that a lot of I would like to think that some of my fantasy has more of a distinct message than that, but not all Noble Bright fantasy is message fiction in any way. It's you should read it and feel better about yourself and about better equipped to love other people when you're done with it.
You and your decisions matter.
Yeah, you matter, your decisions matter, other people matter, and you can love them and make the world a better place by your choices.
Well, and before the podcast started, we were joking about how the religion question used to include Lord of the Rings, but you took it out because everybody loves Lord of the Rings. But think about what Lord of the Rings is, because there are questions of faith, there are questions of redemption, there are questions of sacrifice, all of that's in there, the parts that are hopeful, the parts that are despairing. That kind of classic fantasy is, if it's not exactly Noble Bright, it's definitely where the roots of a lot of that also comes from. And so you say, everybody chooses Lord of the Rings as the best one, and it's not just because it's epic and spanning and everything else, but I mean, who doesn't love Aragorn? That
Legolas
heroic thing, and Legolas, and but you could go through everybody in the Fellowship and point out changes in their character and the way that they change and they grow. And I mean, take Merry and Pippin and the difference between where they start and where they end and who they've become and what they've learned, and then what they turn around and teach to others. Because they go back to the Shire, and the thing we miss out in the movie is the Scouring of the Shire, where you see them come into their own, that now they are going to be the defenders of that little part of their world, because that's what they learned in the journey, was how to be the ones that stand up to the bullies and how to be the ones that say, we're going to bring the community together and we're going to kick these guys out and we're going to do all of this. And I don't blame Peter Jackson for not putting in the movie, because there were already 14 endings as it stood and there was no way to close off everything. But in the books, when you read it, that kind of highlights that journey that they've been through. And that's a lot of those same Noble Bright kind of aesthetic. And yet people all over the board read and enjoy Lord of the Rings or Narnia, which is a much more,
explicitly
based on
religious.
explicitly, thank you, explicit allegory, same kind of thing. A lot of people still come to that and they love it. So I don't think that it has to be that specific. We're talking about a classic story structure. Joseph Campbell and the Hero of a Thousand Faces. A lot of that comes this classic story structure, which tends to lean towards noble right kinds of stories.
Okay.
All about second breakfast, that's right. And 11 C's and luncheon and the
Anybody
hobbits had
who's
the right
ever raised
idea.
a teenage boy knows exactly what hobbits look like in real life when it comes to
Gosh,
eating.
yes.
I don't know where the kid puts it all, but
15 minutes after dinner's over, somebody's butt is sticking out of the refrigerator because they're back at it.
And all of the memes where like they're talking about the Excel doesn't let them put breakfast twice. Oh, you've already entered that one once. No, it's second breakfast. It's okay.
That's right.
So we've talked about some of the common themes, and I know we do have a hard out time limit for Jana. She has to do things like work, and I don't know what that's about.
I have to go play Dungeons and Dragons. We're in the Underdark, running away from the Dark Elves, and we're having a very good time. So I get to go play Dungeons and Dragons when this is all over. I'm very happy about it.
Fun times. So what is it initially that drew you to noble bright fiction, and when did you become aware that it was a thing? All of you can answer, but since you're go, let's go.
So I have always written. I don't know that I ever could have written anything other than Noble Bright. It just is. It's not compelling to me. Anything that I wrote was going to end up Noble Bright, whether it was fantasy or not. I did not expect to publish fantasy, so that was kind of a little bit of a surprise. It was not what I went to school for. But I published my first book and enjoyed it and was like, oh, I should maybe publish the second one that I already wrote because I love my characters. And then it just kind of kept going. But I don't think I've ever been drawn to write anything other than noble bright fantasy. I read a lot of everything, but I was never really interested in writing anything else. The word was a little bit of a surprise. I think you mentioned Hope and the Patient Man. The author of that and I were on Google Plus in a group together a long time ago, and he and I kind of were talking about like how do we describe what we wrote, because I don't feel like it fits in any real genre out there. And his actual first word that he came up with for my book was cheery bright. And then he was like, that really doesn't fit because it's not cheery, but I don't know what else to call it. So then we kind of found Noble Bright in the tabletop gaming world, even though neither one of us were really gamers. So I did not have any background in that. But we kind of found that like alignment chart and we're like, oh, this is where I fit. I get it. Because I'm diametrically opposed to grimdark in every way. But I don't think it was really being used for books at the time. And grimdark was just kind of taking off, and the word grimdark for books was just starting to get more popular. And we were a little slow trying to get Noble Bright accepted and like popular as a word. But we wanted a word other than classic fantasy because it seems very presumptuous to say, I write classic fantasy and, I've just published my, I haven't been around for 100 years and it doesn't feel good to say, well, I write young adult fantasy is not necessarily what I'm writing, even though it's clean because it doesn't have young adult themes and tropes necessarily. And it doesn't feel good to say it's classic fantasy, and it doesn't feel good. It's not utopian. So what is it? It's not grimdark. It's how do I tell people that it's the opposite of that? And it does feel a little weird to say like, well, I'm the opposite of something. That's not how I want to define us. But grimdark had so much popularity, and the Game of Thrones TV show had just gotten really, really big. It seemed like that was the easiest way to let people know in a very concise way, like, what is it that I write?
So is that something that's been trademarked, or is it just a generic term? Because, with the game lit RPG et al., those people argue incessantly about what's what. Is that something you see with the Noble Bride or the Hope Punk or anything in those genres?
No, someone actually advised me to try to trademark Noble Bright very early on, and I felt like in some ways like it was very tempting because I wanted several people online had started writing their own review essays on what they thought Noble Bright was, and it was stuff that I really disagreed with. Like, that's not what I am trying to promote. But it also felt like if we're trying to start a movement of authors and readers and get this word out into the world, trademarking it is just shooting ourselves in the foot. Like, no one's going to use the word if it's trademarked. And what I want to do is spread the word so that other people know what it is and self-identify as, I read Noble Bright or I write Noble Bright fantasy. And if you can get some kind of critical mass of authors writing Noble Bright who mostly define it the same way, then that's what it becomes.
Okay. And what about you, Jana? When did you first hear about it, and what is it about that style of story that draws you in?
I first heard of it being called Noble Bright when Chloe told me that's what it was called.
Good job, Chloe.
That is honestly it. So writing stories that have that kind of thing for me came from being a lover of classic fantasy. And so when I said these are my very first book that I wrote, I was 13 years old, and I finished it and I sent it into Tor, and it was really, really fun. And back in that day, some
Nerd.
of the had time to, I totally, with pride, my dear. But back at that point, some of the editors actually had time to hand respond to 13 and 14-year-olds that sent them a giant pile of paper, because that's what we did back in that day. And I got a really, really nice rejection from Peter Doherty, pointing out that I had kind of rewritten my own Lord of the Rings. And he says, this is, that you're very young, and I can see that you are very influenced by some of these great classics, and you have talent. I advise that you keep writing and send us more stuff when you're ready. It's the sweetest rejection letter that I own, and I own a lot of them. Most of them are form rejections, but it's the sweetest rejection letter that I have, because he was able to point out, first of all, you're kind of copying from the classics, and you're not good enough at it yet to where you've made it your own. And second of all, it was his encouragement to keep writing. And that's where mine came from, is because I loved some of those themes. I loved that feeling that by the time you got to the end, you were just wrecked because of everything they'd been through, but you were also in a better place. And as a mom, we recently read Lord of the Rings to my daughter, and oh my gosh, when she thinks that when Pippin falls in front of the Black Gates, she lost her crap and burst into tears, and she said, "He can't die. He's because." It was like, okay, you need to breathe. And she's like, "You have to tell me that no more of my hobbits die." And I'm like, well, we're actually even going to get Pippin back, so it's okay, because otherwise we weren't going to read anymore. And she was totally wrecked, but then so happy with where it became. So that was it for me, is loving those and wanting to do stuff like that had those messages that things can turn out all right, that sacrifice is worth it, that things happen, and it takes you to a better place. So I don't know. In fact, I'm certain that many of the things I write do not fall under the actual definition of Noble Bright, because I couldn't put a specific finger on it. I don't know that I have that completely written, but I know that it's in proximity. There's a Venn diagram, and somewhere what I write, most of my stuff overlaps with this. And so it's kind of fun to find a new term for it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I've always liked hopeful stuff, because I grew up in a military family where it was like service and honor. All those words meant something. They weren't just placards on a wall. Throw in a little bit of the Catholic guilt, and you've got a recipe for wanting to be a Boy Scout and leave the world a better place. But I didn't really get too focused on it. I read a little bit of everything. I think in high school I read more romance than anything because I was convinced it would help me understand girls. And if you heard this before, you'll hear it again. But plot twist, it does not. But then when I started reading after, and then I went in college, and in college you don't get a chance to read much of what you want. You're reading stuff picked by other people, and it's generally not the best. As an English major and as a history major, everyone was dead, so I couldn't argue with them, which was no fun. But when I got after, I always promised myself in college when I graduated, I was going to read what I wanted to read because I wanted to read it and for no other reason. And then, of course, the head injury, and I didn't read for years. So when I started reading, it was in conjunction with I was doing therapy at the VA for the PTSD and the head injury. And so for me, like when you've seen the darkest places the world can show you, you don't want to go there again. That's not healthy for your mental health. So I actually intentionally looked for, I don't want to say it was like bright and shining stories, but I wanted hopeful, right? I wanted to know it could be better because, obviously being better requires someone to take that first step. But I know that's probably a lot to say. I just like the idea of something getting better at the end. But what about you, Chloe? Because you were the one.
My turn.
Because you were the reason we're doing this panel, so I figured you had a lot to say.
Yes, I have a story. This is a narrative. Hang with me. So when you write books, they tell you, they tell you that you have to go out and read 60 or 100 or 250 of the top books in your genre and figure out which ones you're like so that you can market like they do and you look like them and you act like them and you get their readers. And I did something like that. And I went and I downloaded sample after sample after sample of the top indie books off of Amazon, and I didn't find a single one of them that I liked. And that's a terrible thing to say, and I will never put a name on any of those things because people love those books and it's not my possession. I don't want to say that those are bad books. I just didn't like them and they didn't write like me. And I kept looking and eventually I gave up. And I went into a season where I was writing short work because I am terrible at short work. I'm really good at long novels and they continue to kind of get longer. But I was going to get the discipline put together to actually write short. So I did 6 months of nothing but short stories and I was going to try to sell them and I was going to teach myself how to do these things. And I got to the point where it's like, okay, I need to start joining groups and looking for places where I'm going to be able to sell short work just to see if I can do this as part of the discipline of picking up that craft. And I'm scrolling through Facebook groups looking at calls and they're interesting and I'm going to go submit to them. And I see this call go by for Noble Bright and I'm like, oh, that's me. I found me. This is it. And so this is the book. This is the name, C.J. Brightley. Got to get my left right. And this is my name. And I am in this book. This was the first short story I ever sold.
Can you flip the cover again? I threw you on solo and I wasn't fast enough. Oh, that's a pretty cover. Yep. I like it.
And this was the moment of, okay, these are my people. And because Noble Bright is such a broad concept as a genre, I think that it sort of triggers a swords and sorcery, second world, medieval Renaissance type fantasy because the word noble is sort of associated with chivalry. And so it's really easy to look at those kind of books and go, that one's a Noble Bright one. That's what, with the right themes involved. But so much of anything can be Noble Bright. I submitted like dark urban fantasy to one of these things and she took it because apparently my definition is close enough to hers. And it was just this realization that I don't have to write the same genre to find the readers that are looking for the same feeling, because this has been my pace as a writer since I started writing. I couldn't write something else. I can write any genre you want. I've written actual Westerns. I've written all over the place for genre, but I always write Noble Bright because I couldn't possibly do something else. And it was not until I saw the call for submissions that I realized that that's exactly what I write. And I've never done anything else and I never will. And it was just really fun to have that coming home moment of, okay, there are people out there like me. It's just that we don't fit into an Amazon category real well.
Yes. I would love to make it an Amazon category, but because Noble Bright is not about the setting or the clothes or, I mean, I have a Regency-esque, Jane Austen-esque with fairies Noble Bright series, and I have dark, scary, near future dystopian urban fantasy that is on the dark side of Noble Bright, but it's more explicitly Christian. And I have like classic sword and no sorcery, pseudo medieval-esque that's very Noble Bright, and then like modern fantasy romance, the Noble Bright. It's in DC, Northern Virginia. It's not about the setting. Like some of the Phoenix Crate books that are Noble Bright are like steampunk and with zombies, and some of them are like steampunk circus with trains and magic. And some of them are more epic, and some of the settings can be any different thing. But it's about the ethos and kind of what you take out of the book, not what it looks like.
So I know we've got a hard out, so I got one more question for all three of you. So has there been, like, obviously, first off, you can get an Amazon category once TradPub starts asking for it, because they wanted medical romance for their Harlequin books. And then all the indies started, like all the indie steamy stuff started filling the category, and then they got really mad. But it can happen. You just got to get TradPub to ask Amazon. For some reason, they answered to that. But has there been any pushback since you guys have started sort of naming this trend of storytelling style?
Yeah. What about you, Chloe?
What I see, it's not from Amazon. Amazon doesn't care. I would love to see a push into Amazon, but again, it's not mutually exclusive with any of the other categories that makes that really challenging. I think there was a phase where they were talking about doing a women of a certain age, a midlife fantasy subgenre on Amazon. Like they'd gone and talked to them and gotten it approved, and I think it existed for a hot minute. I don't know if it's still there anymore. And that's not mutually exclusive with any other genre. It just was a weird niche that they had enough books and enough readers that they managed to talk Amazon into doing it. I would love to see that. And I think Amazon just doesn't know. It's a big enough corporation that they're agnostic of the existence of the subgenre. Where I see it, though, is on the big reader groups, because the big reader groups see Noble Bright as an unsophisticated genre. That it's wishful thinking and it's childish, and that grimdark is a much more mature, realistic way of looking at the world. And so the Noble Bright authors, and by extension the Noble Bright readers, are childish and in denial of what reality actually looks like. And I see it a lot, and they refer to Noble Bright as conflict-free fiction. They refer to it as something where nothing bad ever happens, and it's just simple pushback on the concept of fantasy where decisions matter. And it doesn't matter how many times you go and defend that line. That's not the argument that's happening. It's not about knowledge. It's not about information. It's not about ignorance. It's about, we don't really want this genre to exist, and so we're going to fight against it with slurs. And I see it commonly enough, and I've at this point stopped hanging out in those groups, because I hang out in better indie fantasy groups that are happy, because those groups aren't very happy either. I see it commonly. It's around.
That's ironic, since, I mean, I grew up in a large family, so I've got, like, if you tell me you're my cousin, I'll believe you, because there's so many I haven't met them all. And so I will say that children can be sophisticated if they're educated. I don't think child necessarily means dumb, like some people like to pretend in modern culture. I would say more unjaded is what you get with children, because they haven't been smacked in the face by by life yet. So, but that's interesting that you would get pushback on something that was hopeful.
Yeah.
I guess there's different strokes for different folks, and there's something out there for everyone, truly. All right. I know you have a heart out first. So as we wrap this up, Jana, what are you writing as who? And then how can they find you?
What is it writing as who? Jadlyn Asher is currently writing a billionaire romance, which is tremendously fun. And it's an older female lead and a young hot stud that come together. And so that's kind of fun, because it's
told me you weren't going to write about me. I'm sorry.
Don't ask, don't tell, man. Lovely. Please do. And then right now with Jena Rey, I am working on urban fantasy. I am going back and working with a series that got derailed by health problems several years ago, and it really deserves its time in the limelight. And so it's getting some focus now so that I can get the rest of the series put out, and then I'll do a big relaunch of the first books and kind of bring the whole thing along. So those are the biggest things I'm chewing on. There's always lots of little things in the corner, but those are the two biggest ones. And if people want to find me, they can find me at opalkingdompress.com, or they can go on Amazon and under Jena Rey, Jadelyn Ashton, or Janet S. Brown. You can find me in all the places, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm on just use those names. You'll tumble into me.
So I will say she's also working on legal shenanigans because she is working on the contract. We have talked in the past about that we were going to start I guess it's game lit. I don't know if it's lit RPG where the lines are.
It's game lit.
Game lit, that works. But her and I had started one based on Celtic fiction or Celtic lore that was really fun. And we got to a point where it was a good stopping point. And we said, okay, let's finish our current projects. This is a good place to end it before we can come back and finish it. And in the meantime, I had been working on a similar book in the genre with James Ward at the time he passed. We did not have contracts. Well, at this point, the estate has agreed. And so Jana is working on those contracts. And because James's history with TSR, that we know that Hasbro will look at this book. And so I needed a co-author who knew where all the bodies were buried, so I didn't step in it on accident. So Jana is volunteered or voluntold, depends on who you ask. And so we're working on the contract that the estate and us will sign to make that happen, honoring his wishes and then taking it forward in our own vision. So she's also writing legal code.
I know. That is the least exciting stuff, but I did do some legal. I have a legal background in certain areas, and so I can at least go through a contract.
And there's a reason she's publishing us and not me, because I don't want to have to deal with any of that nonsense. And apparently, I have learned that LegalZoom is not the best if you want IP protections, because I had an IP lawyer look at our contract that LegalZoom did, and they're like, yeah, no, fix this, 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 and this. So, oops.
Yeah. my legal background is that I married into legal. So I take all this stuff. I go to my father-in-law, and I go to my cousin-in-law, and I go to all the other people who are lawyers, and I say, look at this and tell me what I'm all screwed up. And they sigh, and they fix a bunch of stuff for me, and they send it back to me, and then I forward it to other people.
Anybody who grew up,
do my legal stuff.
Anybody who grew up in a large family knows I have a cousin or I know a guy totally counts as qualification.
I know a guy.
That is the good thing about a large Catholic family. You name a specialty, I'm probably related to someone who does it.
Too true.
So, all right. What about you, Chloe? What are you writing, and then how can they find you?
I am writing the last book in my Verity universe for a little bit. I went and actually put together my next 5 years worth of books. They're sitting on a Post-it note stack right here next to me, and I'm going to make it exactly 12 months before I come back because I'm a sucker. But I'm winding up in a happy place, and I've just finished the last scene. I've got my after credits scene left to write, and I am handing it off, and I'm taking 2 weeks of writing random short stories as a palate cleanse, and then I dive back into a space opera series that I haven't touched in a couple of years, and I'm really excited to be going back there next. You can find me at chloegarner.com or on Facebook, or if you want to find where I actually act like a human being, that is my Facebook group. It is my most favorite place in the whole world.
You know, when I started writing and I talked about my process in the beginning, both on this podcast and just in general, people told me they thought I was OCD. But I want to thank you, Chloe, because now I feel normal because you make me look sane with your schedules and whatnot. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm glad to be a reference point.
All right. What about you, CJ? What are you writing at the moment? And then how can listeners and viewers at home find you?
I am just finished the very last round of copy edits on the 4th and final book of my Christian fantasy series. Here's the proof.
Let me put you on the
Children of Wrath. And
that's a nice cover. I like it. And it's a dragon.
It is a very scary, beautiful dragon.
I love dragons.
And so that book will be published in the next couple weeks. And then I'm starting edits on a fantasy fairy tale romance. It's kind of cute and cozy, but it has a werewolf and a vampire in it. And I never thought I would write a werewolf and a vampire book because because the Christian series doesn't really count. They're not exactly werewolves and they're not exactly vampires. But this one actually does have a werewolf and a vampire. But it's more like fairy tale-ish, not urban fantasy at all. It doesn't feel like what I think of as a, werewolf vampire book. It's set in the same world as The Silent Prince, which came out last year. It was a Little Mermaid reimagining. So it's kind of a similar feel, maybe not quite as funny. But that's the Kickstarter link that we'll share. And that will be coming out probably next year. So I've done the first draft. I'm working on the edits for that. And then you can find me at cjbrightley.com, and Brightley has an EY, so it's a name and not an adverb.
We should make bringing being an adverb and a name together. We should bring that back. I don't know if it was ever a thing, but we should make it a thing just for you.
That would be cool.
All right, so I will link the Kickstarter too. It is not going live yet, and I have told her she's going to come back and talk about her Kickstarter and then one of her series, just so we can dive more deeply into her chaotic mind. But with that being said, this is the part, dear listener, where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right books find the right readers. And if you want to know more about Noble Bride, I linked to Joe Vastachek's explanation of it. He's an outsider kind of take because he does not write it. We will link to the the Phoenix Crate. If you want to find out more, it's listed as a sponsor. And is there as we wrap this up, is there anywhere that is like a Facebook group, somewhere where Noble Bright readers hang out that we can sort of direct people to if they want to find out more about the community of readers?
There is a Noble Bright Fantasy fans group, and then there's a Noble Bright Fantasy authors group where we can talk about like group promotions and cooperative things. There is also noblebright.org, which has some book reviews on it. And I love being able to feature other book reviews that are not just by me, because I do not have time to review all the fantastic books out there. So please send in your reviews. You can check out the website too. I would love to kind of get that more off the ground. And then of course, Phoenix Crate. So.
Okay, and I will get with you offline to get that link for the Facebook group that you mentioned for readers if they want to check it out. Speaking of checking out, you can find us on our link tree at linktr.ee, linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things, the bits, shoots, the rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters, the Blasters and Blades Facebook group and Facebook page, and most importantly, Madam Stabby Stab on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email, where you give all the shenanigans her way. We have our Blasters and Blades podcast at gmail.com email for professional purposes only, people. Save the shenanigans for Stabby. And more importantly, we have our website over there on Spotify.com. Bunch of gobbledygook since they bought it. I promise it's easier to go to the link tree. But when you get there, you can support the podcast for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. Every penny counts, and we greatly appreciate your patronage. Or you can support the show more directly over at their buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Hanley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Hanley. Be sure to put in the comment section this for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee until it pours out of their eyeballs, and then we will film it and we'll make more money on the video. But if you want to try that coffee brand coffee, I've been drinking their s'mores until I run out, at least, because it's seasonal. But the Coffee Brand Coffee link is in the show notes. Podcast Grunts is the discount code. You get 10% off. We get a kickback. It's an American company made in America, employing Americans. I promise you, it is not a dropship company. So if that matters to you, supporting local, there is that, and we will link to that in the show notes as well. And with that, thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy and absent co-host, I am J.R. Hanley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. And just for those curious, Stabby and Nick couldn't make it today because it's their anniversary, and apparently that matters, and they had to go out and do the anniversary thing on the day we recorded. I think I'm more important than their wedding anniversary, but they did not agree. I don't know what that's about. And with that, thank you for coming on, CJ. This was fun. Thank you for suggesting it, Chloe and Jana. As always, it's a pleasure. And with that, I will hit the end button so we don't say something off record. Wait for it. Ready?